welcome everyone. We are the Education 3.0 Research Network. We have some amazing folks with us today. You're going to hear some of the wonderful work happening out in Phoenix and around the nation. I'm Chris Purifoy with Learning Economy Foundation, and your co-host is Greg Nadeau with PCG and IMSK and others, many other things. And so, I'll just go ahead and hop in. Today, we are going to be discussing the Trusted Learner Network, which is a really amazing innovation. It's one of at the top of our list at the Ed 3.0 Research Network. We think it's just remarkable in many ways, not only for its innovation and access control for the learners and the institutions, but in the way that it really empowers the learner. It's there to be, the ethos is right, we believe. It's about better access and control and agency and all those types of great things. And so I'll turn it over to Greg, and he can open up our panel.
Terrific, thanks, Chris. So hi everyone joining. I think this begins what may be a march through the alphabet of A is for ASU Trusted Learner Network, and B is for the Broward CLR Lab, and C is for the Colorado C Lab, and D is for the Digital Credential Consortium, and then IEEE is where we all do this together. Looking forward to hearing about A. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself, and then Kate and Roger?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. My name's Phil Long, and I am the Special Assistant to the CIO and CTO at ASU, and sort of the current cat herder of the project for TLN on the ASU side. The TLN standing for Trusted Learner Network. We're going to try really hard to keep the TLAs to a minimum, trusted the acronyms, and do so calling each other out if in fact we lapse back. And I'm joined today with two of the team members from ASU, and I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate Jovicchini. I'm the Director of Software Services at Arizona State University, working in Ed+. I have the distinct pleasure of working with Phil, Roger, and a very tight team of technical innovators on the Trusted Learner Network. I sort of serve a product manager role with the program.
My name is Roger Kohler. I am a senior solutions architect working for Donna Kidwell, our CTO, and work on a lot of interesting initiatives, including the blockchain one, which is awesome. And I wouldn't say it's the Arizona State University blockchain, because it's the Trusted Learner Network. We really look at this as a network for many universities.
Good correction there, Roger. And that's actually important insofar as the Trusted Learner Network really is intended to be a sort of a third space that institutions and entities that have an interest in issuing assertions about learners and their abilities and skills can place those in a common shared distributed location, leveraging the capabilities that that distributed ledgers bring to the table, and allow the individuals who have the to whom those assertions are made, or about whom those assertions are made, access to and curation responsibility for and dissemination of those credentials in their hands, so they can share them with whom they wish, and we like to say, tell their story with data to back it up. So that's the sort of the core idea of the Trusted Learner Network. It is, I should say, a collaboration between ASU and Salesforce, the technology company, which began more as a joint exploration as to whether this idea made sense from each of our perspectives. And and after some rapid development, became clear that there was, in our view, a there to pursue. And so we have been working together for almost 2 years now, to elaborate this idea to the point where we've been able to test it in a number of proofs of concept, and now it's working towards the deployment of an actual production application for a very narrow use case, but one that's very important to public institutions, particularly universities and community colleges. Greg, you want to take it from there?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess let's just start with kind of the basics of, can you just take us through a little bit more of an in-depth description about what the Trusted Learner Network contains, and then maybe, and then talk about the initial implementation that
Sure.
you just described, and then we can talk about kind of how does this become a generalizable service that folks outside of ASU might connect with.
Sure. So I'll start, and then I'll let Kate and Roger then correct me, because I'm sure I will. I'm sure I will need clarification and expansion, and perhaps even some just plain old correction. So the Trusted Learner Network is effectively a blockchain environment, and in our case, it is a private permissioned blockchain environment. That's sort of a very key distinction that segregates work that we've been doing from many others that have been in this space in the past. It is based on a set of nodes. You can sort of think of it as a node per primary issuing institution, but that's because our framework began from the university context. It doesn't necessarily require a node per issuing entity. That's just a convenient way to think about it at the start. But it is we've expanded the underlying architecture from just the instance of the blockchain node, and in our case, it's a Hyperledger Sawtooth backend. And we've added to it essentially an indexer to speed queries, which is Postgres, which is connected to each of the nodes. And we've added an IPFS node to allow unstructured or non-structured data to be stored and linked to the blockchain. We think one of the things that we're trying to accomplish here is not just build a transcript as we have traditionally thought about it, that's a little bit richer for a college or a university or a high school, but rather a record of an individual's accomplishments in education, training, and work that lasts their lifetime. And so this key notion that it lasts their lifetime is really important, because it means that the various entities that an individual engages with for education and training and work will be many over the course of their life. And so the consistency, the one area, the one focal point that remains constant is the person themselves. And so it becomes their aggregation from all of these different interactions at different stages of their work and learning that the TLN is intending to capture. And as a consequence of that, we are also looking at its expansion beyond traditionally embellished transcript kinds of assertions, but also around evidence of the individual's work, evidence of their learning, more descriptive data that we began from extending the Open Badge Initiative version 2 data specification, which actually is a very rich starting point, and broaden it from there. So we've got that part of it done in a way that's compatible with the comprehensive learner record, and we certainly are going to be supporting the comprehensive learner record in our interoperability, so that there is a way of exporting to the CLR that subset of our record that fits into the CLR format, comprehensive learner record format. But we have more in mind for that because of this longitudinal generational lever container for individual achievements. Before I go any further, let me turn it over to Roger and Kate for elaboration or anything you want to emphasize in that context, and maybe what you think the next frame should present.
I do have some. You completely captured it, Phil. But I'd also just say some might ask why blockchain, and I think we all come from a place where we see that value, and we've been through the discussion. But just for this panel, you could ask why use a blockchain? Couldn't you do this with a centralized database? That's technology that exists. The reason it's called the Trust Learner Network is a blockchain is about digital trust. So it's a way to allow institutions to digitally trust each other in a secure way and share information when they may not have full trust. So it's not like we're all going to be owners of the same database, because a university typically wouldn't have one student information system that all the universities all put their information into. Universities have their own student information system. So the blockchain allows us to do is have a network where we can have trust among these institutions digitally and decentralize it so that it's not one person in charge. So it's not ASU in charge. It's not whatever other schools get on board in charge. It's a community of trust. And that's, that's been pioneered with digital cryptocurrency and such, that peers can trust each other and they can share value through cryptocurrency. And it's also a way that universities will be able to share transcripts in a safe, secure, trusting way. That's the only other comment I had.
Okay.
And I would only build on that to say that I think the other thing that makes me really excited about this project is the trust that's being built between institutions is absolutely crucial. But another thing that the Trusted Learner Network unlocks is a level of agency for our learners that is essentially unprecedented up to this point, right? A transcript or a work history is held by an institution or an employer, and that information is only released really at the institution or the employer's behest. What the TLN can allow us to do is to really empower learners and workers to be able to take that information and, again, like Phil said, not just sort of exchange the traditional methods of data that we are used to, right, which is the transcript that travels to earn someone the advanced degree or to get someone into their bachelor's program, but just a new level of storytelling that can happen when a learner or worker is able to sort of compose a narrative about their achievements over their lifetime. I think that's really, really crucial.
So the members of the network will be those issuing entities, those organizations that make claims about an individual that they want to see shared and which the individual wants to have aggregated as part of their record, and of course the individual learners themselves. That's sort of the core of the community that this represents. And we started off in this context with a permission private network because there already exists amongst many sets of institutions local collaborations where they have built through business relationships or through various other formal engagements a level of trust and methods for managing that trust relationships amongst them. And we thought as an adoption strategy, a good way to go forward was to leverage existing trust relationships that exist amongst institutions. In our case, for example, the first application of what we call reverse transfer, that process by which community college students transfer into a 4-year, and then while in the 4-year curriculum, they end up taking courses that can complete a 2-year degree, which they may have left unfinished before when they made that transfer. There already exists all of those relationships in place and between the community college and as a feeder school, so to speak, to the 4-year, which we can leverage without having to go and build computational methods to assure that there is trust there.
Now, Phil, is the reverse transfer what you just earlier mentioned as the initial production starting point?
It was and it was very strategically chosen in that it is a relatively narrow use case, and it is one that is, in fact, I mean, to be quite candid, it's one that's basically between the institutions as opposed to the individual learners. The learners have to give consent, and they can follow along, in a sense, the process by which credits that they've earned at one institution are assessed, evaluated, and or complemented with credits from their community college as transfer of, of equal work. Um, but it is really a recognition on our part that in order to make this actually an adoption process with a potential for success, we need the buy-in of those people that feel that they are responsible for the credentials at their institution. And that's typically someone in the role of registrar or something along those lines. And they're the ones at those institutions that effectively own the legal responsibility of saying this record is accurate and correct and represents what our institution has invested in and assessed this person to be able to do. And if we have those individuals willing to step in and say we're willing to put those records on this third-party system, then we've gone a long ways into building out the possibility for lots of other people to want to join and put those things in place. So it was this is a carefully chosen use case to start with.
Excellent. Well, so maybe let's start with kind of the big picture questions. Kim Hamilton, who I think is on this call here, and I talked this morning, and we discussed kind of 4 big questions that this project and related projects need to answer. And so I'll say what they are, and then maybe we'll kind of break them apart a little bit one by one. The first is, how do we know the issuer is the issuer? Second, how do we know the learner is the learner? Third, how do we know that the assertion has never been altered? And then fourth, how do we know what the assertion means and how it exchanges with others? So I don't know who wants to start with. I think, Phil, you said the first 3 are addressed by what you're doing, and the fourth is perhaps not yet in scope, but of interest. But do you or anyone want to comment on that?
Sure. Well, I'll start, but I'll also quickly turn it in the case in this particular case over to Kate, and with hopefully help from Roger. How do we know who is the issuer? That the issuer is in fact who they say they are. So in our particular case, by having this beginning of this process as a set of trusted relationships that already exist, the issuer is a recognized institution of, in our case, education, either K-12, community college, or 4-year, and they are entities that have their own processes for instantiating them as a valid purveyor of assertions about an individual's progress and learning. That is, they typically have gone through their own accreditation processes and the like to say they actually are who they say they are, and that this particular program has criteria that an accrediting body feels is substantial enough to be merited and permitted to issue the degrees that they are doing. So we start from that perspective. And so when the individual issuer makes an assertion about a person's abilities, that process involves making that assertion, but also signing that assertion in a digital way that guarantees that they are in fact the person who put it there in the first place. And it is encrypted in a way that they hold the key to. So that goes with the assertion itself into the storage environment, which we're using as the blockchain. So in the institution's case or the issuer's case, it's a much more straightforward thing at the start. I think underneath that is the question of the organization that is going to be behind the TLN that has to form. which then has to decide through governance processes who can be admitted into this private network and given the privilege of making assertions. And then that process needs to have essentially another layer of the community that is the core group saying this new person that wants to be admitted to as an issuing institution, are they really worthy of being in the community, and have they met the criteria that we all ourselves have gone through, and do we think it's an appropriate entity to have as part of the network? Kate, do you want to elaborate at all on that?
But yeah, I think I would. So I think you did a fabulous job of capturing both the technical way that the architecture sort of executes this trust of the issuer. But I would just add that that the TLN is sort of reinventing this level of trust whole cloth, right? It's built on the relationships that institutions already have with each other, right? And so the convening of this community to include new institutions in the private network is an act of registrars and humans and institutions trusting one another. So in that way, the blockchain technology just very accurately sort of represents the way that we do our business right now, which is I think a great way to do business. You know, it's the relationships that institutions have with one another, that they have with their accreditation agencies, and just wanted to point that out. Roger, what do you think?
I would just say the very mechanics of a blockchain are built to ensure that trust. So a blockchain is built so that the issuer is stamped on the record, and blockchains are inalterable. They're immutable records, which means every node has an exact copy of that whole blockchain. So it adds to the security, because if someone were to try to alter the issuer or alter a record, the copies that the other nodes in the community have will catch that change. So there's really no way that you can alter records in a blockchain, because the community acts as a net that supports that there are no changes, no alterations to that record. If I issue a record as Arizona State University, I know that that's my ID and I'm the only one that can sign it with my ID. And then the community accepts that through consensus, and the community all has a copy of that. And every subsequent record is based on what was built above, and it only adds up if everything is aligned. So nothing can be altered. And if someone even alters my database or someone hacks my system, the community is holding on to a clean record, and that consensus of what the true immutable record is means that data is safe and it can't be altered.
So maybe for all of you, think forward though, 5 years from now, right? And we're thinking at the scale of the internet, right? So for example, I talked to Victoria Fang on Monday. She may be on this call, who is Academic, I think is the name of the company. And she was talking about mostly Chinese high school students applying to high schools and colleges inside of the United States. And so the issuing organizations of those credentials would be perhaps unknown to the admitting organization. So it's much less of a private network of known entities that already have trust relationships, and a much more open environment where we don't know really who necessarily that issuer is. We have a digital identity, but we don't know really, what Brant Red refers to as the digital twin, right? Which is, is that MIT or is that M1T? Or, how do we know that issuing profile is actually connected to some real legal entity that we have some relationship with? Right. So when I ask about is the issue, I think what I heard you say is really, well, within ASU Trusted Learner Network is an existing network of known entities, known between the other organizations, accredited institutions that already have those, that the humans already have a trusted relationship. So I guess the question is how do we extend that beyond that type of network, where there are many unknown entities that are participating in the learner's lifelong achievements? Right.
So I think there's two parts to that, at least, Greg, and one is that this is, I'll start off by saying that this isn't really a blockchain question in the fundamental sense of it, because it's a problem that we currently have today. Registrars currently get applications from places around the world with transcripts from those institutions that they may not have heard of before, and are confronted with that conundrum as it stands now. So the solution is really one which we have to collaborate with our partners around the world, or potential partners around the world, because it's really, I think, what you're describing is what's the another three-letter acronym, KYC. What's the know your customer process that applies to an institution that allows you to feel confident that they are who they say they are, that they are the actual purveyor of the training, that they are directly involved in its assessment and the assertions that are generated from it. And blockchain per se is not going to solve that problem. It can take a process that is built, and when there's agreement that the problem is solved, it can then convey it, accept the record and share it, and say that the process that led to the KYC and generated the assertion we now believe is from that institution, and can be shared. But I think what you're describing is this very, very challenging and difficult problem of how do we know that in some, pick the location around the world that's from, let's say naively from the US perspective, obscure. How do we know that the process there has the kind of practices applied to it, which we would interpret as representing rigor, as representing that validity in assessment methodologies to make assertions, and that the individuals who are undergoing that, in fact, are the individuals who they say they are, because we are proxying to institutions today to answer the second question, which is who is the user or the learner. We are proxying that now to those institutions and saying your process of validating the entry of them as an admitted student is one we will take as a valid representation of who that person is. And I think that's an important, that KYC process is really critical. In the US, we're thinking, and perhaps other places that have these kinds of structures in place, we're looking at things like, maybe this is a role for libraries. Libraries in the US, for example, typically have a notary public as part of their services to their local community. And those notary publics take documentation in presented by an individual who wants something that's signed that says the person in front of me is who they say they are. And so if you extend that idea to a learner, then one idea could be that an institution who otherwise doesn't have the ability or hasn't got in place the practices that really can validate that the person presenting them to the institution is who they say they are. Maybe there is that proxy through an existing process in the US. That doesn't address the question that you asked about it, institution in China, but it would require our ability to collaborate with those locations around the world and demonstrate what we think the relevant elements are of that verification process and what the appropriate equivalent documentation might be in order to be able to ascertain that it's being followed in a way that we can all agree with. Kate, I can tell you want to jump in here.
Well, can I just, Kate, before you, maybe, is there a role for some type of a one or more directory service? Is there an organizational registry? There are 15,000 school districts. There are 100,000 K-12 schools in the United States. You can't know them all, even within Arizona, right? So is there some need for some type of, directory, registry, or service? PESC has EdXchange, which contains geocode and has a way of beginning to think about kind of directory services. But is there something like that that's needed for this ecosystem to work?
Well, I think as you're pointing it out, there are existing services there today, like the one you described for EdXchange and PESC, which satisfy some of those validation steps that bring a degree of confidence and authenticity to the information that their members are exchanging. And so the short answer is absolutely. One of the things I think that is really characteristic of this space is that we do not believe that there is a monolithic entity that has this role. We don't believe that there is any one cross-national organization that likely will have this role. We see this as something that is a patchwork, and almost by definition has to be, that solves this problem in ways that are locally effective and useful. And then we begin to sew these patchworks together in order to be able to have something more extensive and more comprehensive. So I don't think that there is a single place that's likely to happen, and it's in many ways it's kind of like we're all moving towards, I think, identity services that are fundamentally grounded in self-sovereign identities. And the self-sovereign identity has the same sort of characteristics. So you can self-assert you're who you say you are, but it has to have some sort of process behind that, which gives varying levels of displayed and transparent affirmations of that person's identity that you can then say, oh, I get it. These are the combination of things. Roger or Kate?
I do think it's, well, first, Greg, that is a great question. I think a lot of people do ask, in the blockchain space, they go, well, is this really a purist blockchain because it's not public? So it really boils down to, well, we know cryptocurrency, we know Bitcoin, and these are all, public. And the true ideal behind this decentralized trust is that you trust people, and it's open to the public. But that does put a lot of onus on, you don't really know who those other nodes are, which is where your question was directed. Because this is a private network, we really are kind of punting that to some degree, basically saying we will know, the community will validate these nodes. So it won't be like ASU saying you can join this trust learner network. It will be the community and the governance of that community that will say, we think this district in South Dakota is going to have a node, and the community will agree to trust them as an issuer. And then the next one wants to join, and the community will agree. So the private element of this is saying that the technology is at a place where we want to know that issuer, and our registrar wants to know, not just from like a technical person like me saying, oh, I can tell you that in this decentralized world, you should trust them. The registrars are more pragmatic business people that want a real knowledge and say, I know that's South Dakota school district, and I know that our community has agreed with that, and oh, I happen to know the person that's in charge. So I do think there's some pragmatic considerations in making it private, specifically because the data has a long lifetime, like Phil said, and because we want to make sure the nodes are issuers that we know and trust. If that makes sense.
Yes, although how do you know and trust the 15,000 school districts in America who are relating to your network?
Like Phil said, this is going to be a patchwork, and I think what I would take from that is that this is going to be an iterative and organic process for a number of reasons. I mean, we can throw around self-sovereign identity all we want, but I think we can all recognize that that's a nascent concept, and whether it'll be adopted by individuals and institutions is, man, that's up in the air. And so to draw back from Phil, this is going to have to grow with the guidance of the community of the TLN. I don't think we have, I'm happy that we don't have an answer for that, because because this growth is going to happen. And the way that districts, okay, so you keep saying 16,000 districts, the way that those organically organize themselves, it's not organic. The way that those are organized in, say, the United States would be completely foreign to the way that districts or educational groups or work groups probably organize themselves around the world. So I think it's a wonderful question that I think we look forward to posing with our community and sort of molding to shape the circumstances that we run into.
Okay, so those are the first two of how do we know the issuer is the issuer and how do we know the learner is the learner. The third one was how do we know that the assertion by the issuer has never been altered? And I think that one's an easy one, right?
Yeah, I think that's that is the essence of the distributed ledger technology, and effectively, if you follow the way in which the ledgers, the various forms of those ledgers work, at least in the blockchain context, we all are relatively confident that the process by which individual assertions from any given entity, place them into the blockchain for being assessed and evaluated and then committed. And assessed and evaluated, I mean in a technical sense. Are they conformant to the structure of the record that needs to be followed in the sense that the right fields are described the right ways and things like that. That is not a malformed record. We validate that the credential of the institution represents the digital signature of what we expect, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are then aggregated together. The block is then hashed and added to the previous block that's already extant, and those things are linked together. And the process of that successive set of connecting those pieces gives us very strong confidence that if any attempt to alter an element of those pieces is made, then the integrity of the entire structure leading up to it is immediately apparent and clearly violated, and then we know that there's been a problem. So the integrity of the block, and that's one of the advantages that the architecture provides, the integrity of the blockchain really does allow us to say, we know for certain that this thing has not been altered since the time the issuer has made the assertion and it has been accepted into the case. And thereafter, it's important to understand that as a learner or a worker who has their records in there, they cannot alter either the record about them, because the person the entity that actually created it with the private key in the first place is not them. It's the institution that issued it. So they can share it. They can choose not to share it. They can even, to some extent, by not sharing it, hide it, but they cannot change it. And that's the key thing. So that's why we think of their responsibility as curation, as opposed to anything else. The one area where we are interested in supporting is self-issuing, and the notion that I, as an individual, might have learned some skills in my engagement with a particular activity that I initiated myself, and so I want to somehow capture that and add it to a description of me. And in doing so, I would, in our view at least, we'd like to follow the model that was originally asserted in the badge world, where there is endorsements associated with that assertion by some third party with metadata about who that endorser is, so that it's very clear to the individual looking at it that this is a self-assertion, B, these are the entities that are endorsing it. It's take it at your own risk as to whether you believe those are appropriately individuals with the qualifications to make that assertion and judgment. That results in the endorsement. So that whole process is one that is sort of a lesser or a distinct level of validity in one sense than something that comes from a formal institution.
So within the constraints of the Trusted Learner Network, where issuing organizations are known, then you have that trust and you have the ability to put the full assertion record with PII on the blockchain. There's questions I think about as we take this model into a more open ecosystem, and whether the mechanics of how the assertion is verifiable to the ledger. But I think that those are all kind of easy. Those are all kind of within within what people are already working on. But let's go to the kind of the final question of the first four, which is, okay, so now you have these information that is being that is from trusted issuers about trusted learners with unalterable assertions. But now, what does the assertion mean? How do you think about within trusted learner network the academic genetics, as Mike refers to it, of what makes up each credential, each letter grade, each mastery assertion, and how do you compare them into other jurisdictions that have their own competency frameworks and ontologies, and et cetera?
That's a great question, and it's one of the exciting things I think that some of us that have an academic background are very enthusiastic about, because in some sense what we're doing is opening the kimono of our institutions and showing or at least inviting people into the position of being able to see beyond the cover. And we're doing that by creating the data model that has the places that in it that would recognize and capture activity or elements of good pedagogical practice. So for example, if you make an assertion about an individual's ability to do X, you would like to know by what rubric was that assertion judged. You would like to know what are the assessment methods that the rubric that were applied with the rubric in order to make that assertion and claimed at whatever level of expertise the assertion is presenting about that individual. And better still, you would like to have pieces of that individual's work that were part of the assessment that were done as a consequence of the rubric under which the learning was taking place, and have the individual who's looking at this record, give them the opportunity to peel the onion down and see these elements in there. Those are things that we currently don't do well in higher education, at least in any way that is commonly agreed, and in necessarily in ways that are immediately exchangeable with others. So our hope is that by building a model like this, using the best input we can from our teaching and learning colleagues, that this record will sort of start to shine a spotlight in the things that have stuff in them, and more likely shine a spotlight on the things that are sitting there and basically empty, because we haven't done this yet. And I mean, some of it is quite surprising in many ways. We would like every course that goes into a record of an individual from an institution to have its corresponding syllabus searchable and available to the individual that is supplemental data about that course. Well, it happens that there's a lot of institutions that do not have a requirement that a course has a syllabus. Most do, but not all. And there are lots of reasons for that historically and the like. Better still, those that have them are structured wildly different from one place to another, even within the same institution, even within the same college, even within the same department. And there are academic arguments for why that should be appropriate, that it's the freedom of the faculty member to decide the structure and the way in which they want to organize the learning activity of their student in their course. But the problem with that is, at least at some level, it makes comparability extremely difficult to determine. And so for a neutral third party to look at this collection and say, that's kind of like this, is difficult. And we know that, and we're hopeful that by doing the work that we're doing, we add to the interests of all parties to address this problem in a more concerted way and try to solve it more effectively.
Well, this may be where your sector-wise, younger siblings in K-12 may be able to contribute something back to our higher ed brethren in terms of the focus that has happened in K-12 on academic standards and really making very measurable the distinct skills and then comparable between jurisdictions.
Indeed, indeed. And then we always, I mean, with some truth, we always think about good pedagogical practice, and the models that stand out are things like what happens in kindergarten. And I think the same is writ large is also true here.
Kate and Roger, do you guys want to comment at all on the underlying academic genome?
I do have some. So one thing that I just think I find it fascinating is as we move toward more competency-based, where we can capture competencies, and even if we don't capture competency and we just capture courses, realize that the Trust Learner Network would allow a student to share that record. So if you think of the current higher ed model, the value to the student is the degree. I get a degree and maybe I can use that to get a job. I might put that on my resume. But with the Trust Learner Network, you could potentially share a verified class completion or a verified competency within that class. This could change the whole value proposition to students, where you could start leveraging the skills that you're gaining during your classwork to immediately get a job, to immediately have that impact internships and what you're doing. And you wouldn't necessarily have to wait to the degree completion to see that value. So in some ways, it's a fascinating change that this will open the door to, where students could leverage skills in classes in a much quicker turnaround.
Okay, so people talk about the learner having a wallet, right? Is a term that I think comes out of certain technologies. And so if in this wallet you have perhaps hundreds, thousands of granular achievement assertions, not just, 3 diplomas, but hundreds or thousands of skill assertions coming from your K-12 experiences and then your co-curricular activities and all of your letter grades and things. Is there anything that you all have seen in the market, or what do you, something that a wallet that can handle that type of data? Or what are your thoughts about that?
That's a great question.
Maybe I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Can I take a shot at that? So I think it's very astute. I think instead of focusing on particular wallet technologies, which we're still, I can't think, all learning about that and becoming more familiar with that. I think one of the crucial things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to build very smart ways to manage, organize, and share out of all of these assertions. So we're very intent on thinking about things like collections, right? So being able to collect a set of credentials and assertions together that say, hey, I have great skills at basket weaving, and this is my basket weaving collection. And you know what? I'm also an engineer. Here's my engineer collection. We think that that's really crucial. And something else that sort of complicates this idea that is an open question is, if you go to a registrar and you say, hey, we're going to let students collate and sort of curate their assertions, that registrar is going to say, you absolutely are not. The official transcript is the official transcript, right? So we have to be able to address this tension, and that's something that we're actively working with, in our use cases right now, actively working with our registrars and our partners to figure out how do we both allow a registrar to assert a transcript as a whole unbreakable entity, right? Because that's crucial for certain types of processes. And at the same time, how do we allow a learner to curate a collection of assertions out of many? So that it's an interesting tension that we're dealing with. Do you guys have anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I do think it's interesting. This is one of those questions that keeps me up at night, because we're adding richness, we're adding the ability to be more expressive and all of the rest, which is great. The question that emerges from all of this is, So if I present this stuff to a third party and I give the individual who receives it the opportunity to dig down on all these pathways about my capabilities, at what point are they just going to say, give me the bloody CV and I'll take it from there, and overwhelm them with goodness, to the point that it defeats the purpose? And I think that's the challenge that we have. How can we present layers of this richness in a way that tells a story of a successive depth, but allows the person looking at it to choose the level of depth that they want?
That's right.
Right. And I mean, in many ways, it's the same. It's another aspect of the problem of, we provide this capability to create this lifelong record with all of these potential useful elements in it. How much overhead does that take for the individual learner to curate and manage? How do you go through 15 years down the road to pick out those salient things that are particularly relevant for an opportunity I'm now interested in pursuing? Do I even remember them?
Right.
And what did I index these things? What did I call them? I mean, all of the stuff that we deal with today, now with this opportunity to permanently capture forever, the richness of the life. And that's a real challenge. And it's a challenge both in terms of literacy on the part of the individual to understand how to judge what matters and pull it together. But also, it's a deep, deep, interesting challenge for the user experience to do that in a way that isn't exhausting.
So I just put into the chat for folks who are interested. The call I'm going to in 10 minutes now, or 7 minutes, is with Broward County, who's one of the research labs that we've been talking about. And what I just put in the chat is the beginnings of what Broward is talking about issuing as a request for information to all vendors and providers to talk about what their current wallet technology is, and perhaps more important, what their roadmap is.
Yeah. There's an interesting. The other point I'll make about this is that there's sort of two different ways to think about the wallet technology. There's sort of a flavor of this that comes from the original SSI community, where the wallet is the resource. It is the repository of the individual's records, and there's lots of reasons people from that perspective will argue that that's the right choice. That is, all of the assertions is not something that should be stored in any kind of external chain and the like, but rather they have to be aggregated together on my local device because it's the device that I'm biometrically associated with, and that computation has secure enclaves to minimize the possibility of those things being corrupted, and lots of other stuff. And we, on the one hand, in that purest view of it, agree. That's the kind of an ideal way to be able to do it. We just don't think it's practical, at least for the immediate future. And number one. Number two, it makes it even more challenging if this is the record of someone's lifetime achievements. It seems to us that there really needs to be a third-party location, and that the device that you carry with you is actually the curated set of things that you think are most relevant to the particular point in your life that you're at, as opposed to the place where everything is, and I have to use my phone as the mechanism by which I sort and arrange and stack and send credentials from one place to another. Ultimately, you're going to presumably do that, and that is an appropriate place to have that exchange process. But we do think that in the triangle of an issuer, a holder, and a verifier, that role of holder, which in the SSI world typically is the wallet, is actually the TLN itself. And the TLN is in fact a super guardian for individuals of their history.
Kate, Roger, do you want to add anything to that?
I didn't have anything. I think that's very accurate.
Okay, well, maybe just a final question then. Talk about technical standards. So, Roger, we saw each other at IMS. Um, where do you see the various technical standards fitting? W3C, DID, W3C, verifiable credentials, CLR, CASE, open badge, CLR, IEEE, and those were just a lot of the TLAs that we tried to not to get too much into. But
we are definitely, we will be compliant with the OBI standard, the CLR standard, and verified credentials. At least we have, Phil is really our visionary, but he's been very clear that we will support those standards and have easy compliance with them. So this network is really about meeting those standards. And the OBI, the Open Badges standard, has done a ton of work at kind of capturing those competency level assertions. So we really feel it's important that we align with the work that's going forward there. So we definitely seek that. We also look for other technologies like the self-sovereign identity. We want to make sure we're aligned with that going forward. Yeah. We want to make sure that when we're hosting the digital portfolio, we're using IPFS, which is a interplanetary file system, which is kind of coming to support immutable files that are stored in a decentralized way. And that's an important technology to store the blobs of data, not just the detailed metadata. And that's a critical part of our initiative for the syllabi. And if I was in a class that I made a movie, that I could show that, or a recording of a presentation. So we are looking at being compliant as much as possible across the board.
And how about CASE, Credential Engine, and W3C distributed identity?
Absolutely. I think all those are all elements that I think are kind of coming together to help define the space that they are consolidating their efforts around. So we certainly agree that that the W3C has a role to play in terms of, as we said before, verified credentials and DID. There is probably a reasonable argument to be made that that each of those at this point in time have a focus area. And so there is an opportunity for a space to emerge that may be IEEE, where these different focus areas are brought together. Because I think each of those are good for the particular, if you will, vertical that they're paying close attention to. So for example, the CLR is valuable, but it is really institutionally focused to a large extent. And if you're thinking about this from a work perspective, well, there's probably there hasn't been a lot of attention to that, because that's not been, the IMS as an organization, understandably, is about interoperability standards primarily among the technologies that institutions of higher learning and K-12 are acquiring and using, and to exchange stuff amongst them. But if you now jump out to freelancers and the models of learning and achievements that they're accruing, that may not be an appropriate place for IMS to be coming up with a standard. There probably needs to be an attention to a group that is working on that space. So in our environment, we're looking at places like the schools of continuing education and extended campus instruction as sort of the beginnings of, well, what are they looking at? Because they're the bridge to employers, they're a bridge to a lot of other external activities that students are moving to and are engaged in. What can they add to the notion of what a standard needs to be to represent the experiences around which they are concentrating? So I think that this is a wonderful acronym soup, and we're going to stick with the core ones that we have some familiarity with, but we want to very much keep in mind that the CLR is to hold a data model for a lifetime, and it's intended to be, so we think about, it's not medical records, it's not retail records, there are various verticals that our lives can be categorized as being engaged with in a connection sense. We're interested in the education, training, and workspace. And so the focus that we're putting ourselves on is in the record definition that and the standards that emerge from those communities, and let the other communities do their thing.
All right, well, terrific. Well, I think we'll need to leave it there. We're at the top of the hour. This has been fantastic. Thank you for joining us. This has been recorded, and we'll be sharing out with many other people that way. This will come back next month at this time, and we'll feature a different panel to get into some depth with them. And thank you again for participating.